just so that Scott is as I'm sure any of you who are regular conference goers, Scott is a regular contributor to the whole ELT conference circuit and is very widely known and respected in the ELT world. He has involvement in Cambridge ESOL accredited teacher training schemes and is an examiner for the Delta scheme. And finally, he's also currently Associate Professor of English Language Studies at the New School University in New York, where he directs and teaches the online MA TESOL program. And with that, Scott, over to you, and may the gods of the internet be with me from now on.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric. I hope I don't disappear. Lovely to be here. Welcome, world. It's great. I've been watching the countries fly past us in the chat window, trying to pick a place that I was meant to be in, actually. If anybody here is in Belarus, then I think this weekend I was due to be giving a talk in Minsk. I'm very sorry I can't be there. Brazil was also on my agenda in July for Braz TESOL. That one was cancelled. And even as far away as October, I had a conference down in New Zealand, my home country, and that's been postponed. So here we are online, and we'll make the most of it and the best of it. So this is the title of my talk. It's you might recognize the quotation there in the title, play it again, Sam. If you think you do, you could put it into the chat box perhaps, which I've of course lost, but yes, of course, it's from Casablanca, the movie. And I'm using that quote to introduce the topic of task repetition. And let's start with a bit of repetition. In fact, the title of the talk should really be called Play It Again, Nigel, because here's a bit of authentic conversation between a English-speaking boy called Nigel and his father, who happened to be the great linguist recently departed from us, Michael Halliday. Halliday recorded Nigel as he learned to speak way back in the 1970s. And so this is one of the first documented cases of recording a child through the initial stages of language acquisition, acquiring his mother tongue, which was English. And this is Nigel. He's talking to his father. He's just been to the zoo. And Nigel says to his father, "Try eat lid." Father says, "What tried to eat the lid?" "Try eat lid." "What tried to eat the lid?" "Goat," says Nigel. "Man said no." "Goat try eat lid. Man said no." Okay, so he's telling a little story about something he witnessed at the zoo. Then after a further interval, while being put to bed, now he's talking to his mother. And he starts again to tell the same story, little Nigel. "Goat try eat lid. Man said no." You see, he's put it all together. The mother asking perhaps more leading questions than the father, who just simply repeated the question, "What tried to eat the lid?" Mother says, "Why did the man say no?" Nigel says, "Goat shouldn't eat lid. Good for it." Mother then reformulates that nicely into kind of adult speak and says, "The goat shouldn't eat the lid. It's not good for it." Nigel, "Goat try eat lid. Man said no. Goat shouldn't eat lid. Good for it." So now he's put the whole thing together. So working with his father and then with his mother, he's got a whole turn which tells the complete story about the goat not eating the lid because it wasn't good for it. And then it adds, Michael Halliday adds at the end, the story is then repeated as a whole, verbatim, at frequent intervals over the next few months. So this is a story that he rehearses, he learns, and then he repeats it again and again whenever he's got an opportunity. And I think those of you who've got young children will be very familiar with this kind of routine whereby the child develops a little narrative and then repeats it wherever is possible. And that's really a nice introduction to the theme of task repetition, because what he's doing here, he's repeating not just the individual words, the individual sentences, but he's repeating the whole narrative. In other words, he's repeating the task which is to narrate the incident at the zoo. Now, when we do this in the classroom, we see a similar kind of thing. What happened to Nigel here is, remember, he started off with just 3 words, try, eat, lid. And then he elaborated this into quite a long, for a 20-month-year-old, quite a long little utterance. Goat, try, eat, lid. Man said, no, goat shouldn't eat lid, not good for it. And this is what we get with task repetition in a second language as well. We get elaboration. And here's an example. This is from a piece of research done by Martin Bygate, who's one of the earlier advocates of task-based learning, also my professor at the University of Reading, I have to say. And he was very interested in this notion of task. So here we have 3 students who are doing a task in the classroom, or a classroom-like task. And the task is to look at a sequence of pictures and to recreate the story collaboratively. They haven't heard the story. They're just working together, the 3 students, and they're putting their ideas together to tell the narrative. A bit like Nigel and his goat. This time it's a group family who goes to the park with their dog, blah, blah, blah. Now, on the left of the screen, you see the first attempt, a transcription of the first attempt. On the right, you have the third attempt. So they've done it 3 times now. They've told the same story collaboratively. They've had no instruction, correction, feedback during this sequence. It was done purely to see what would happen if you asked students to do the same task, in this case, 3 times. Now you can see already on the third attempt that it's considerably longer than the first attempt. And if we I just want to highlight some of the differences here. So he go with his dog in the first attempt becomes, in this third attempt, they went to picnic by car with their dogs. I have sandwich becomes they had lunchbox. One people played football becomes the man was playing football. And the dog is barking becomes the dog was barking. So you can see it's not perfect, but by the third attempt, there's considerable movement in the direction of not just more accurate language, so not the dog is barking, but the dog was barking, for example, but much more complex language. And the whole story has been elaborated, the characters have been given names, blah, 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 etc. So this is what happens then when students repeat tasks, that at every level, there's an improvement. There's an improvement in accuracy. There's an improvement in complexity, complexity meaning the kind of syntactical elaboration of the sentences, whether there's subordinate clauses, etc., as well as the range of vocabulary. We get words like countryside, for example, in the third attempt, but they're not there in the first attempt. So there's more complexity, both lexically and grammatically. And also textually, because there's characters now, we've given names and so on. And then presumably there's more fluency. We don't have a measure of how long it took them to say the third attempt, but the evidence suggests that when, and I'll come back to that in a minute, when students repeat a task, there is a strong effect. There's a significant effect, meaning an improvement from having repeated the task. This is Martin Bygate summing it up, and he goes on to say that the research evidence strongly supports the view that the previous experience of a specific task aids speakers to shift their attention from processing the message content to working on formulations of the message. So that first attempt, if we go back, was all about like, oh, what's happening here? What's going on? Let's, so there's hamburgers and there's a dog and they're playing football. And then once they've got the content, then they can start shaping it and making it more and more target-like. So that's what he means when he says the speakers can shift their attention from processing the message content to working on formulations of the message. And just another little bit of background theory to support this. Norman Segelowitz, in this book on fluency, says from the perspective of cognitive science, he's arguing that what we do in the classroom shouldn't only recreate the mental processing involved in communication in the real world, but these activities should also provide learners with opportunities for systematic repetition in order to activate and reactivate the same set of cognitive processes. Let me just explain what he's saying here. It's not just about becoming, producing the words more quickly, fluency in the mouth, as it were. It's fluency in the brain. So as you formulate this story, as Nigel's telling a story about the zoo, or these three students are talking about this picnic, they are activating and reactivating a sequence of cognitive processes. And this is what repetition, task repetition, is all about. It's not just mindless, rote memorizing of the story. No, it's running an algorithm, as it were. It's turning the computer back on and letting it run again through the same kind of boot up operations. He goes on to say, it's important to note that what must be repeated is the whole set of mental processes involved. It's not just repeating the production, but it's the planning and assembling and execution must be repeated. And this must occur, he adds, within genuinely communicative contexts. And so, again, just let me repeat what he's saying here is we're talking about repetition. It's not repetition at the level of sentences. It's not like drilling. It's not repetition at the level of words. It's not even repetition at the level of a whole text, which you just memorize and recite. Yeah? No, it's repeating the cognitive processes of doing the task. It's lubricating those processes so each time they become better and more efficient, and that the language is the result of all those cognitive processes being activated and reactivated and reactivated. So this suggests then a kind of sequence in the classroom. And this is, if you can see this diagram, this comes from a recent book that Martin Bygate edited on exactly this topic, research articles about task repetition. And so if you start at the top, you have the input for the task. So the students are going to do a task. It may be telling a story. It might be planning a picnic. It might be designing a poster for the classroom. There's the planning, there's the rehearsal, and then what he calls the comparator, comparing it to maybe somebody else doing a similar task. And then they perform the task. They perform the task. And then they reflect on it, review it, revise it, get feedback, and so on, and maybe compare it. And then they do it again. And they do it again, and they do it again. And that's the task repetition sequence. Now, I can hear you thinking, oh, that sounds like really boring. What students of mine are going to want to do a task that they've already done reasonably successfully? What are they going? Why should they want to do it again? Isn't this going to be really boring? And it's not boring for little Nigel, of course, because children love not only repeating tasks, telling stories, but they love hearing stories being read to them again and again and again and again, the same story, the same story, and the same story. There comes to a point, of course, as we grow up that we get tired of repetition. Although I have to say, I mean, people listen to the same pop songs again and again and again, and sometimes watch the same movies, go back or read the same books, etc. So there is a certain tolerance for repetition. But we can see that for busy teachers are thinking, why, if I do that again, that means I'm going to run out of time. I've got the whole syllabus to get through. They've got to get the exams, etc., etc. So the challenge is, if repetition is so good for you, if it's good for the, if you get better as you do it, you get more fluent, you get more accurate, your language gets more complex, then how can we build repetition into the curriculum, into the syllabus, into the lesson, without it becoming boring? And that's what I want to talk about. Various ways you can do this. If this was a workshop, I'd put you into groups and you could discuss amongst yourself, but it isn't. We've only got another half an hour left. So let me just talk you through some possible ways of providing opportunities for repetition without them being necessarily boring. And so one way of doing it is you have the students do the same task, but they do it with a different person. Yeah? So it's a classroom management kind of challenge. So, yeah, okay, you've just told your story to Juan. Now I'm going to shift you around and you're going to tell your story to Mercé. And off you go again. So the change of interlocutor, the change of person you're talking to, creates the impression, at least, that the task is not really being repeated. It is being repeated, but it's being repeated to a different interlocutor, and therefore it's intrinsically more motivating than just doing it again to Juan and again to Juan and again to Juan. And there's various ways of doing this, of course, in a classroom. You can do all sorts of clever things depending on the space that you've got and the number of students, obviously. But here's some different organizations in Jim Scrivener's book, Learning Teaching, where you can have students in little groups in different parts of the room, and then you change one person in each group to create another configuration. So when the person changes to a new group, the others have to kind of explain what they're doing to that person, and he can also put in his input or her input into the buzz group. Now, of course, those of you who are working online will see here, oh, buzz groups, that sounds familiar. That might be like going into a break, what's it called? Say breakdown class room.
Breakout room.
Break. I'm having a breakdown. Thank you. The breakout room.
Scott, you're doing fine.
So there's possibilities there. I want you to think while you're listening there, how could you adapt these kinds of organizations to a real, to online teaching? The wheel is the kind of what I call the onion. It's like two concentric circles of students. Yeah. So the one concentric, the wide wheel could be around the classroom, the walls of the classroom. And there's a student facing each student, and they then do the task. The task could be something like, the ones who are standing around the room everybody could have prepared a poster, for example. If it's young learners, it could be a poster of their family, yeah, or it could be even a photo of their family. And they're standing there with their photo, and they are talking to their interlocutor, who says, who's that? Is that your mother? Is that your father? What's her name? What does she do? Blah, blah, blah. And then at a signal from the teacher, the inner circle will move around one. And so they've got a new partner, or alternatively, the outer circle could all move around. It doesn't matter, but there's one of the circles moves around one person. So they've got a new partner, and they repeat the task. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same, because the student who's asking the questions will be asking different questions than the last person, but they'll be similar questions. And they're very focused on the photo or the diagram or whatever it is that is the prompt for the conversation. It's a bit like a poster kind of presentation at a conference, if you're familiar with those. People stand next to their poster of their research or whatever, and people mill around asking them questions, etc. So they end up repeating themselves a lot. But of course, what happens in the classroom is that each time they repeat themselves, they are getting more fluent, more complex. They're throwing an extra vocabulary. They're picking up things even from the people who are asking them questions. Here's a picture of me demonstrating this at a conference in Ramallah, where you've got 8 women don't look like they're in circles, but they are kind of each, and they're doing a family tree describing activity as I remember it. And then from a cue from me, they move around. So if you imagine, even with just 8 students, they're going to repeat this activity how many times? Well, at least 4, but then you change the roles. And so the outer circle becomes the inner circle becomes the outer circle, and they do it again. And so even with 8 students, there's 8 possible repetitions of that task, and each time it's with a different focus. So that's, if you can do that. Now, of course, the challenge is if you're teaching online, how do you provide those kinds of opportunities? We can maybe talk about that at the end. Okay, so that's one thing. You can change the people that you're talking to. And then you could do the same task, but you change the time. And this is the famous 4-3-1 activity. You must have heard of this. So I'm going to talk to my partner about my favorite free time activity, which is playing ice hockey. And I'm going to tell her about ice hockey for 4 minutes. And she's going to listen, and she's also got her phone, and it's on, and she'll tell me when I'm run out of time. And then she'll tell me about her favorite free time activity, which is rock climbing. Okay, I'm inventing this. Obviously, I'm not really into ice hockey, but hey. And so she does that for 4 minutes. And then we do the same without any kind of repetition or feedback. I mean, without any input. I'll do the same, but I'm going to do it now in 3 minutes, and she's going to do the same. And then we'll do it a third time, and it's in 1 minute. So the challenge is to say the same amount of stuff, but to do it successively more quickly. So the idea is that there's no sacrifice of content, but the content becomes so much more fluent that it takes less time to deliver. And you can do that with any kind of task, but that one, describing something that's important to you, is, I think, as good as any. It could be a narrative to it, could be, you know, what did I do last weekend, and so on and so on. So the idea is not to cut stuff out, but to say the same amount of stuff in as fluent as possible time. I'm doing that now, actually, because, I mean, this is not the first time I've done this talk, surprise, surprise, but I normally have an hour to do it, and this time I've got 3/4 of an hour. So what am I doing? I'm trying to be as fluent as possible. I hope you appreciate that. Okay, so you can change the time. So we're just changing variables in the task performance procedure, and we've changed the interlocutors, we've changed the time. We can also change the information. It can be the same task, but we change the information slightly. So, I mean, typically the emblematic, the iconic communicative activity task, which is information gap activity. So here you have students doing an information gap. They're paired up. They've got pictures. They've got a worksheet with pictures of different people. And A is describing choosing one of these people on this picture and describing that person to B. B is listening, maybe asking some questions to determine which person is being described. So classic information gap. And they're using all their kind of lexical and grammatical resources to be able to do this. Now, each time they do this, they may be doing it with different, same interlocutor at the same time, but they can choose a different picture. So basically, that's the task is held constant, but the information, the data that they're processing is slightly different. This can be true for any information gap activity. Another classic one is the describe and draw. So I'm going to describe a scene to you, a landscape, and you're going to draw it while I describe it. And then you can change the picture of the landscape, or you can change it from a landscape to the inside of a room, etc. So basically, you're holding a number of variables constant, but you're changing, in this case, the content. And then the fourth possible variable is to change the mode. That is, okay, so we've done it as a speaking task. Now I want you just to write it. And I think this is a great idea for any kind of speaking task that's been, you know, relatively unstructured. It may be a discussion. Students, 3 or 4 at the beginning of the lesson, have a discussion about something they've read on the news or whatever. And then you say to them, okay, great, okay, fine. Now just write a summary. Write a summary of what you talked about. And if it needs a point, you can say, write a summary for the person who's not here today. Little Juan, he's absent, so we're going to write a summary for him. So that gives an audience and a point to the writing. So they write a summary. So what they've got to do is get all these various ideas that they were talking about and try to coalesce them onto paper. And that's such a good exercise, because the very activity of writing, of course, focuses attention on the form much more than just speaking. So any kind of movement from speaking to writing, but it also can be from reading to listening. And we're talking about tasks as if all tasks were production tasks like speaking and writing. But of course, some tasks are receptive, like listening and reading. So having read a text, maybe in their textbook, then say, okay, now I want you just to listen to it, cover it up and listen to it. So the same content, but different mode. And the previous experience of reading the text is going to enhance their ability to listen to the text, or vice versa. All sorts of permutations of that, of course. They can read and listen. They can listen without reading, and so on and so on. So yes, so it's very important to emphasize here, we're talking not just about speaking tasks, not just about writing tasks, but also reading and listening tasks. And as a side note, I think it's interesting that the texts in course books, we tend never to revisit them. We give students a reading text, we give a listening text, and that's it. End of story. But there's a lot of value, I think, of going back to a reading text that they've read maybe a month ago, revisiting it and say, okay, just remember that text about the woman who lives in a cave? Let's go back and read that text again and have the satisfaction of being able to read it quite fluently, hopefully, because they were familiar with it. And also there's the other notion that I just want to mention in passing is that of narrow reading. Narrow reading is where you read not the same text, but a text about the same topic. So it's a similar text in terms of its content. The vocabulary is going to be sort of fairly repeated, but maybe it's a text, a news item, and it's breaking news. So we're reading the first item that came out, and then we're reading it an hour later, and then maybe a day later, and then a week later. So we're reading about the same story, but it's been added to, it's been changed, it's been explained, it's been et cetera, et cetera. So, and this is really, really good. Again, research into narrow reading shows that it creates that it's more fluent because there's more familiarity. Instead of jumping from topic to topic to topic, which often is the case in the classroom, they're reading about the same topic because they can choose the topic. They can choose an item at home that they want to follow, a piece of news, and read it there. This needn't be something that's done in the classroom. Okay, and then I've added here unrecorded to recorded. So they may be doing a speaking task, they do it live. I mean, they do it to their classmates. It may be a show and tell. Show and tell, great activity. God, we used to do that at school when I was a kid. I think it's a fantastic idea. You bring something, you tell the rest of the class about, and everybody has a turn. Every morning it's a different student. But then having done that, how you can have them repeat the task, say, okay, good, that was good, fine. Now I'm going to record it. Yeah, I'm going to video you, or even just audio you. But it's going to be recorded, and that adds an extra dimension of challenge, but it also concentrates the mind. It's a bit like writing, etc. Oh, I'm going to be recorded. I'm going to pay more attention, if possible, to getting it right. I had a yes. Okay, well, we're running out of time, so I've got to be more fluent. Okay, and finally, you can change the purpose of the task. You say, okay, we're going to just talk about something freely and fluently, and now you're going to do the task again, but this time I want you to focus on accuracy. And this is where students themselves can work on this. This was the wonderful thing about the old-fashioned language laboratories, that students could just work away, getting more and more accurate on their pronunciation by just repeating, but that was just repeating words and sentences. But if you repeat the task, if you say to the students, go home, or if they are home, do this again on your own, and again, and again, and again, and then record it for me and send me the recording. And if it's you're teaching online, you've got a class of lots of students, they're sending you recordings. There's lots of apps and things you can use to post these recordings to the rest of the class. Here's one that has been recommended to me, Flipgrid, so they can do short recordings on their phone, send these to the teachers, and these can be posted so other students can listen to them as well. So this is something with the motivation of publishing it for the rest of the class. It doesn't seem like it's the same task because they're doing it again and again to get it right. It's kind of rehearsal, rehearsal, rehearsal. Okay, so those were the kind of variables that we've looked at. And I just want to finish with make a couple more points. Here's another activity which would be great for online learning. Earl Stevick, who was a writer on methodology, in fact, his book, Way and Ways, was the first book I ever read about English language teaching, and it made a huge effect. But he talks about one of his favorite techniques here, if he's in a one-to-one situation, which a lot of us are in, either used to be when we were teaching private classes or whatever, or online. So this is the technique, is you tell something to a speaker of the language. So you tell them, what you did at the weekend, you tell them about your favorite hobby, and they have that person tell the same thing back to me in correct natural form. So I'm going to tell you, the teacher, and then the teacher reformulates it, tells me it back. I then tell them the same thing again, bearing in mind the way in which I've just heard it. So it's going back and forth, like ping pong. And you can do this any number of times. And the cycle can repeat itself. Yes, he says 2 or 3 times. An essential feature of this technique is the text. The text, this we are swapping back and forth, originates with me. It's my text. Yeah, it's my text. I'm invested in it. It's my story. It's my weekend. It's my hobby. So I can control the content. The teacher controls the form. And so that's, as he said, a very useful technique, particularly for one-to-one teaching. Now, the last thing I want to mention is the role of feedback, because it's one thing to repeat the tasks, and students will get better repeating the tasks, but they'll get better even quicker if there's some kind of feedback between each of these iterations of the task. And Martin Bygate again says a key component of successful learning in context using tasks has been found to be the presence of feedback associated with repeated practice. So repetition, yeah, but feedback. So we get a kind of cycle like this. So starting at 1 o'clock, there's the task, you do the task, you get some feedback on it, you repeat the task, get some more feedback. Now the feedback needn't necessarily come from the teacher. The feedback could come from other students as well. They can always, and they can have a frame to organize their feedback, saying, what did you like? What would you do again? What would you improve, etc., whatever. But there's, as what I'm saying, it's not necessarily the teacher. Of course, the other point I want to make is that task repetition is not always, doesn't always result in, it's not linear. There is the improvement, maybe in terms of, say, fluency, but there'll be a trade-off in terms of accuracy. So the more fluent you get, less accurate, or vice versa. So there's always that trade-off between fluency and accuracy. This was a study done by Diane Larson Freeman a few years ago and reported, where she had various students who'd moved or were living in the USA to talk about their experience of living in the USA, Chinese-speaking students of English. And she recorded them over several periods of time, and noticed that in this particular instance, the student varies considerably in each repetition of the task in terms of the prepositions. 2 years ago, I lived in Detroit. 2 years ago, I lived at Detroit. I lived in Detroit. When I came to Detroit, I lived at Detroit. She also had the students write the same task. So they weren't just speaking, but they're writing it as well. And the same student, notice this is in the written, on the second table, when she said in Detroit, she wrote at Detroit. And when she said at Detroit, she wrote in Detroit. And it wasn't until November that it kind of started to kind of synchronize. But I think there's something we need to bear in mind. We can't expect instant improvement, that every time the students repeat a task, something will change, but might not always be for the better, but it doesn't matter. Keep repeating, and you'll get to the point where you get substantial change across the board. That's the theory. But you never step in the same river twice. We're talking here about repetition as if we're talking about rote learning. No, it's not rote learning. Everything always, that whenever you do anything again, it's always different. It's always different. So the last word here to Alistair Pennycook says, repetition, even of the same thing, always produces something new. So that when we repeat an idea, a word, a phrase, or an event, or a task, it is always renewed. And on that note, we've got 10 minutes, and I'll take questions that have been, I hope, collected for me by Eric. How are we going, Eric?
They have indeed. Thank you very much, Scott. Super. That was great. Lots of questions. I've tried to sort of group them a little bit. First of all, a fairly practical question. In your example of Nigel, can you remember, or do you know how much time there was between the first and the third attempt?
Nigel,
Yeah.
about the goat at the zoo.
Yeah.
I presume. Yeah, no, remember, I think the first attempt, he was telling his father, and then that evening when he was being put to bed, he was telling his mother, and then over the next few weeks. So that it's fairly quick turnaround.
Okay. Yeah, that was a recurring theme, you know, about the repetition, how frequently, within what time frame is it?
Yes, no, and because within the case of the second example with the picnic, I don't know actually what the time frame was. I don't imagine, because it was for research purposes, they would have left it for a long time. I imagine it was probably, it might well have been within the same day in successive iterations. And I think we know with repetition that there's an effect that repetition is best when we're learning something, or vocabulary, for example, if it's staged over increasingly large periods of time. So you review vocabulary that you've learned almost immediately, and then the next day, and then maybe 2 days later, and then this idea of spaced repetition is very important. So I would say probably it applies also to task repetition, that if it's spaced, but increasingly larger spaces, then it's going to have a better effect on long-term learning. But I can't quote any research necessarily that supports that.
Okay, super, thank you. Another question is about levels. Is repetition particularly useful at specific levels?
I think at every level. And I think, I mean, obviously you're limited at beginner's level, the kinds of tasks that you can do, but I've suggested some which would be very simple, which is, and I remember when I was in a class learning Catalan here in Barcelona, and we had one day we brought along family photos. The mileage that we got out of those family photos was just incredible. People are just intrinsically interested in your family photos, and so you're repeating and repeating and repeating, and it's very, very basic. My mother's name is, my father's name is, he is, she is, etc. But I see no reason why that task repetition shouldn't be valuable right across the spectrum of levels and age groups, of course, too.
Okay. And what role does repetition have within the construct of fossilization? Can it help prevent fossilization in the first place, or address it once it's kicked in?
Good question. I mean, the whole issue, I don't want to get into this too, the whole issue of fossilization is a contested one, that some people argue there's no such thing as complete fossilization. Clearly, we're always learning new vocabulary, even in our first language. So we don't stop learning a language. We might become, we might plateau. And of course, we all know that students reach a certain plateau. And I guess in some respects, task repetition is one way of perhaps jump starting students from one level into the next, as it were, if there were a risk of this premature stabilization. I think they would have to do it a lot probably to have an effect that was measurable, let's say, at sort of high levels. I mean, the progress, it's like a curve that sort of flattens out, like hopefully like the virus curve, that it flattens out, that you don't see, you don't sense progress as much when you're an intermediate student as when you're a beginner, etc. But I think all the evidence suggests that there's so many benefits for task repetition that one of them could well be that it forestalls premature stabilization. But again, I can't quote any direct evidence here.
Okay, all right. A question specifically around young learners. Do you have any tips for motivating young learners to engage in repetition?
Well, I don't think repetition is a problem for young learners, because like little Nigel, they just love doing the same thing again and again. And I don't think they would really get bored if it was something that they were invested in. So, if it was talking about their pet or describing a recent journey or whatever, I think I think it's probably, I don't know. I mean, but I'm just extrapolating here on the evidence of my association with the young kids. They never seem to get tired of telling the same story again and again. So it's a question of choosing the task, one that's motivating, that they can engage in. And then if it's motivating, engaging about something that they're committed to and interested in, then I don't see any problem of asking them to do it again and again and again, but changing the variables each time. So now do it with somebody else. Now do it standing on your head. I don't know.
Okay. He did that, which kind of leads on to the next one, but this is a very challenging one. How can we do repetition activities in online classes when we have 30+ students? The age of students is 6 or 7 years old. and we can't use breakout rooms for security issues.
Okay. Well, the thing about the breakout rooms, yes, I wouldn't. I mentioned that in passing, but the problem with the breakout rooms is, of course, you lose control of them anyway. So if you're in one breakout room supervising, so I mean, it's not ideal. I think basic kind of activities like show and tell. So you've got a class, you're on Zoom, let's say, they're all there in front of you, and then you delegate one, two, and they've been pre-warned that they're going to be today's show and tell, that they're going to tell the rest of the class something, or they're going to give a short presentation or whatever. Depending on the level and the age group, etc. We're talking about young learners here, so it may well be something as basic as here's a picture of my pet. And then the others listen, watch, and ask questions. And I think, you know, it's not ideal, but it can be done online. We're doing it all the time in our social groups where people are learning how to manage Zoom so they're not constantly interrupting. They say, okay, you, Rania, you're going to be the one who's talking today. Everybody else listens, turn off your and Rania's going to present. And then we'll ask her questions, and then she can do it again. And this time she's going to do it instead of 4 minutes in 3 minutes or whatever. And we're going to listen again. And I mean, you know, so you can't pair them off. You lose that advantage, but there's no reason why you can't think of different ways of changing the task. Or Rani's going to do it again tomorrow, and somebody else is going to also start, and so on and so on. So the students are repeating. I mean, yeah. Don't not try it just because you think you can't translate pairs work from the classroom into the online learning. There's still a value in having the whole group listening to one student doing her thing and then asking her questions about it.
Okay, super. And I think we've got time for one more last one.
Mm-hmm.
When they repeat the task, the teacher can notice the improvement, but do the students notice? Do they know which attempts were correct?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And there's various ways I think you can show them. One is by recording them, of course. But the other one is by telling them. And just an anecdote here. I mean, I've told this story before. When I went back to Spanish classes a couple of years ago, we were given a task to do in class, which was to present to the rest of the class about a city that we wanted to talk about. And we did that, and it was very, very motivating. And I chose the city I was born in, and I talked about it and got some slides, and we did little PowerPoints, and then they asked questions. It was very, very motivating to stand up in front of the class. What the teacher then did was she took copious notes, and she gave me feedback, not just on the things I got wrong, but the things that she thought I'd done okay. And that was positive. What she didn't do, unfortunately, and this comes back to this thing about teachers being afraid of repeating tasks because it might be boring, she didn't ask me to do it again. And you can understand why, because there's a whole 10, 15 minutes of classroom time. We've got the others to listen to first. And what are the others going to do? They've already heard it. Well, one thing you can tell the others to do if they're listening is say, Scott's going to do it again. I've given him some feedback. Let's see, when you're listening, take a note of all the things that he manages to incorporate from the feedback into his second iteration of the task. And so you get, as the speaker, you get a sense of feedback on round 2. They'll tell you, yeah, you managed to get the past tense right, or your pronunciation of that was better, etc., etc. So there are ways of enlisting the other students even into giving feedback to the speaker or whatever. But clearly with spoken tasks, it's much more difficult to measure than it is with written tasks. With written tasks, people repeating a piece of writing, then it's there on the page. You can go back, you can count the number of words, you can count the number of grammatical mistakes, etc. It's a lot easier. But yeah, it's a good question. It's a challenge.
Super. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you so much, Scott. Lots of positive messages in the chat window as well, which is exploding again. And yeah, thank you. So for all of you in the audience, thank you very much for joining in. And please do check out our Cambridge Handbooks for Teachers.
Oops, there it is. Okay, thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you again soon.
Have a good rest of the day, everyone. Bye-bye. Enjoy the future sessions.